The muddy waters of the Missouri River lapped against the weathered dock posts as Margaret Anderson adjusted her worn shawl against the autumn chill. The trading post at Cheyenne had grown busier with each passing season, but today an unusual tension hung in the air. As the daughter of the post's operator, she'd learned to read the subtle shifts in atmosphere that could signal trouble brewing, just as surely as she could read the changing patterns of the river itself. Her father, Henry Anderson, stood at the storage house door, counting crates of supplies while her brother Frank arranged them in neat rows. The family had run this riverside operation for 15 years, building it from a simple camping spot into a crucial waypoint for both settlers and the native tribes who'd long called these lands home. Margaret had grown up learning the delicate dance of commerce and diplomacy that kept the peace between diverse peoples drawn to the life-giving waters. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the tree line, where a group of Cheyenne riders emerged. Their usual trading party numbered 6 or 8, but today more than 20 warriors accompanied Chief Robert Walking Bear. The chief's normally stoic face was etched with worry as he dismounted, his movements lacking their characteristic fluid grace. Margaret noticed his wife was missing. Susan Walking Bear had never failed to accompany these monthly trading visits before. "Something's wrong," Margaret murmured to her brother as he joined her at the railing. Frank's hand instinctively moved to the rifle slung across his back, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Number. Look at their faces. They're not here for trouble." The warriors' expressions mirrored their chief's distress, an unsettling sight among men who typically maintained carefully neutral demeanors during trade negotiations. Chief Robert approached with measured steps, his ceremonial clothing rustling in the brisk wind. "Anderson family," he began, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "We come seeking help." He gestured to a bundle carried by one of his warriors, a cradle board wrapped in elaborate beadwork. "My son is dying. The fever takes him, and our medicine cannot break it. We have heard tales of your white man's medicine." Margaret's heart clenched at the sight of the infant's flushed face as the warrior carefully handed the cradle board to her. The baby couldn't have been more than 6 months old, and heat radiated from his tiny body. Susan's absence suddenly made terrible sense. Among the Cheyenne, mothers isolated themselves when their children fell gravely ill, believing their presence might draw malevolent spirits. The fact that Robert had brought his heir to white traders spoke volumes about their desperation. The following hours blurred together as Margaret drew on every scrap of medical knowledge she'd gleaned from her mother's books and the lessons of the tribal women she'd befriended over the years. She mixed willow bark tea with honey to break the fever, crafted poultices from herbs gathered along the riverbank, and kept cool cloths on the baby's forehead as he whimpered in discomfort. The warriors maintained their vigil outside, while Robert paced the trading post's small back room, his usual dignity cracking with each of his son's weak cries. As sunset painted the river crimson, the baby's fever finally broke. His skin cooled to normal temperature, and his breathing eased into the peaceful rhythm of natural sleep. Margaret's own exhaustion hit her then, but the profound relief in Robert's eyes as she placed his healthy son in his arms made every moment worth it. She didn't realize the magnitude of what she'd done, that by saving the chief's only heir, she'd altered the course of not just one life, but an entire people's future. The warriors departed with their precious cargo as dusk deepened into night. But Robert lingered. He spoke quietly with Henry Anderson while Margaret cleaned up the remnants of her healing work. She caught fragments of their conversation, words about friendship and debt, about bridges between peoples and shared destinies. She thought little of it then, focused on her tasks, not knowing that this day would mark the beginning of a transformation that would reshape her understanding of family, belonging, and her place in the ever-changing landscape of the American frontier. That night, Margaret dreamed of rivers, not just the Missouri that had been her constant companion since childhood, but countless waterways weaving through the land like veins carrying lifeblood. In her dream, she stood at a convergence of waters, where different streams merged into something greater than their individual parts. She would remember this dream later, when she came to understand how saving one child had created its own kind of convergence, bringing together two worlds that had long flowed parallel but separate. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost crystallizing the tall prairie grass. Margaret rose early, as was her habit, to help her father prepare for another day of trading. But before she could begin her usual routine, she spotted a lone figure approaching from the east. Susan Walking Bear, the chief's wife, riding through the morning mist like a spirit emerging from the river itself. The woman's presence, so soon after the crisis, was unprecedented, and Margaret felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders as she went to meet this unexpected visitor. Susan Walking Bear dismounted with fluid grace, her dark eyes meeting Margaret's with an intensity that made the morning chill seem even sharper. In her arms, she carried a small bundle wrapped in elaborately beaded deerskin, and Margaret noticed how the woman's hands trembled slightly despite her otherwise composed demeanor. Behind them, the trading post's wooden walls cast long shadows across the frosted ground, while wisps of wood smoke curled from the chimney into the pale dawn sky. "The spirits guided me to you," Susan said softly, her English careful and precise. "What you did 3 nights ago, saving my sister's child from the river, this was not chance. The waters speak of your courage, and the elders have had visions." She adjusted the bundle, revealing the sleeping face of the infant Margaret had pulled from the flooding waters, the chief's only heir and the future of his people. Margaret felt her father's presence before she saw him, Henry's heavy footsteps creaking on the wooden porch behind her. He had always been cautious in dealings with the tribe, maintaining a careful distance that had served their trading business well. But this morning was different. The air itself seemed charged with possibility, like the moment before a storm breaks. "The council has met," Susan continued, her voice gaining strength. "We have discussed this at length, and the signs are clear. You were meant to be this child's second mother, to help bridge the space between our peoples. The chief offers you a place among us, not as a guest, but as family." The weight of the proposal hung in the air like morning mist, heavy with implications that stretched far beyond the trading post boundaries. Henry stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "Margaret, you don't have to—" But she raised her hand, silencing him. The dream from the night before suddenly crystallized in her mind. The convergence of waters, the merging of paths. She remembered the desperate cold of the river that night, the weight of the child in her arms as she fought against the current, and how something fundamental had shifted in her heart even then. Back in the trading post's main room, Rachel, the cook who had helped raise Margaret after her mother's passing, watched from the doorway with worried eyes. The morning light filtered through dusty windows, illuminating the shelves of trade goods, blankets from Dodge City, tools from Cheyenne, medicines and supplies that formed the lifeblood of commerce along the river. "I understand what you're offering," Margaret said finally, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. "But I need to know, would I still be able to help my father with the trading post? Would I be able to move between both worlds?" The question seemed to please Susan, whose face softened into something approaching a smile. "This is precisely why the spirits chose you," Susan replied. "The old ways are changing, like the river changes its course. We need those who can walk in both worlds, who understand the value of both paths. The chief believes you were sent to us for this purpose." She shifted the baby in her arms and the infant stirred, dark eyes opening to gaze at Margaret with surprising intensity. Henry moved closer to his daughter, placing a calloused hand on her shoulder. "Whatever you decide," he said quietly, "remember that this will change everything. Not just for you, but for all of us." His voice carried the weight of years spent carefully maintaining the delicate balance between the trading post and the tribe, between commerce and community. The morning sun had risen higher now, burning away the last of the frost and mist. From the river came the distant sound of waterfowl taking wing, their calls echoing across the water like nature's own commentary on this moment of decision. Margaret looked from Susan to her father, then back to the child who had started this chain of events, and felt the future unfurling before her like the river itself. Wild, unpredictable, but full of possibility. The late summer sun beat mercilessly upon Margaret Anderson's shoulders as she guided her canoe through the swift currents of the Missouri River. 6 months had passed since she'd rescued the infant son of Chief Running Wolf during a devastating flash flood, and her life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The trading post she'd inherited from her father near Cheyenne had become a gathering place for both settlers and tribal members, though not everyone approved of the unprecedented arrangement. Frank Taylor, a rival trader whose business had suffered since Margaret gained the tribe's exclusive patronage, watched from the shadowy interior of his own ramshackle store as she expertly navigated her laden vessel to shore. his weathered face twisted with barely concealed hatred as he observed several tribal women hurrying to help unload her precious cargo of medicines and supplies. The chief's son, whom Margaret now called Daniel, gurgled happily in a cradleboard strapped to her back. The transformation of Margaret's role had been gradual but profound. What began as an act of desperate courage during the flood had evolved into a sacred trust. The tribe's medicine woman, an ancient grandmother called Many Stars, had taken Margaret under her wing, teaching her the ways of healing and the sacred stories that formed the backbone of their culture. But with this privilege came danger. There were those in both worlds who saw her as a threat to the natural order. Charlie Moore, Margaret's childhood friend and now the town's deputy, kept a watchful eye on the proceedings from his post near the livery stable. He'd grown increasingly concerned about the dark looks and whispered threats he'd overheard in the saloon. Frank Taylor had been gathering malcontents, both white settlers who resented the tribe's presence and renegade warriors who opposed their chief's progressive policies. The tension was building like storm clouds on the horizon. Rachel Clark, the schoolteacher who had arrived from Deadwood the previous spring, found herself drawn into the growing conflict. She'd initially been skeptical of Margaret's unusual position, but watching the natural way the young woman moved between two worlds had opened her eyes to new possibilities. Now she secretly taught reading to several tribal children in the evenings, despite the school board's explicit prohibition against such activities. The situation reached a critical point when Robert Walker, a wealthy cattle baron from El Paso, arrived with plans to dam the river upstream. Such a project would devastate both the tribe's fishing grounds and Margaret's trading route. The tribal council gathered at her post to discuss strategy, an unprecedented meeting that sent shockwaves through the territorial government. Margaret found herself translating not just words but worldviews, trying to bridge an ever-widening cultural chasm. Many Stars had warned Margaret that a great test was coming, one that would determine the future of both her adopted people and the settlement. The old woman's prophecy seemed to materialize in the form of mysterious fires that began appearing along the riverbanks, destroying critical food stores just as autumn approached. Frank Taylor's smug expression told Margaret all she needed to know about their origin, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Little Daniel, now nearly a year old, had begun taking his first toddling steps, equally at home in beaded moccasins or leather shoes. His unique status as both heir to the tribe and Margaret's adopted son embodied the delicate balance she strove to maintain. The boy's father, Chief Running Wolf, had begun making more frequent visits to the trading post, his quiet dignity and intelligence gradually winning over even the most hardened skeptics among the townspeople. Laura Moore, Charlie's wife, became an unexpected ally when she discovered evidence of Taylor's conspiracy. Working as a laundress, she overheard conversations between his men that suggested a plot far more sinister than simple harassment. They planned to kidnap Daniel, believing that without the child as leverage, Margaret's influence over the tribe would crumble. The thought of such a betrayal made Margaret's blood run cold. The autumn winds brought more than just falling leaves that year. Rumors spread of government troops being dispatched from Dodge City to restore order to the region. Margaret knew that such intervention would destroy everything she and the tribe had built together. She spent sleepless nights poring over legal documents and treaties, searching for a way to protect both her adopted family and her father's legacy. The answer, when it finally came to her, was as dangerous as it was revolutionary. Martha Taylor, Frank's long-suffering wife, appeared at Margaret's door one stormy evening, with tears in her eyes and a confession on her lips. She revealed the full extent of her husband's plans, not just to destroy Margaret's business and steal Daniel, but to incite a war that would drive the tribe from their ancestral lands once and for all. The revelation sparked a chain of events that would test every relationship and alliance Margaret had forged. Margaret knew she had to act quickly before Frank's schemes could take root. She sent trusted writers to gather the tribe's council while dispatching Charlie, her most reliable scout, to monitor the movements of the approaching government forces. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders as she stood at the trading post's window, watching the Missouri River's dark waters slide past in the gathering dusk. Martha's revelation had provided the key piece of evidence Margaret needed. Frank had been systematically falsifying documents, creating a paper trail that painted the tribe as hostile aggressors while concealing his own illegal land grabs. With trembling hands, Margaret retrieved her father's old strongbox from beneath the floorboards. where decades of careful record-keeping told a very different story. The autumn rains had swollen the river, making travel treacherous. But Margaret knew she couldn't wait. She arranged for Daniel to stay with Rachel, the tribe's medicine woman, while she prepared for the journey to Cheyenne. There, an old friend of her father's served as a territorial judge, someone who might be willing to listen before the situation exploded into violence. Susan, the chief's sister, insisted on accompanying Margaret despite the dangers. Their bond had grown strong over the years, transcending the cultural divide that Frank and his allies tried so desperately to exploit. As they rode north through the rain-soaked prairie, Susan shared ancient stories of her people's connection to the river, stories that made Margaret's mission feel even more vital. In Deadwood, they received word that Frank had been seen meeting with military officers, no doubt spinning his web of lies. The news spurred them to push harder, their horses struggling through mud-slicked trails as they raced against time. Margaret's thoughts kept returning to Daniel, the boy whose rescue had set all of this in motion, now beloved by both communities. The trading post's ledgers revealed a pattern that even Frank couldn't explain away. Years of fair dealings, witnessed exchanges, and honored agreements between the tribe and Margaret's family. But more compelling were the personal letters, especially those between her father and the previous chief, documenting a friendship that had helped keep peace in the region for decades. When they finally reached Cheyenne, exhausted and mud-splattered, they found the city buzzing with tension. Robert, the territorial judge, received them in his private chambers, his weathered face grave as he examined the documents Margaret had brought. Hours stretched into days as they built their case, while reports arrived of troops mobilizing near Dodge City. Laura, Robert's wife, proved an unexpected ally, using her social connections to arrange meetings with influential citizens who had grown wealthy from the river trade. Many remembered Margaret's father and his reputation for honest dealing. The tide of local opinion began to turn as Martha's testimony, delivered by sworn affidavit, exposed the extent of Frank's corruption. But Frank wasn't finished. Word arrived that he had convinced several prominent ranchers to back his cause, promising them cheap land once the tribe was removed. The situation grew more complex as economic interests aligned against Margaret's mission. She realized that saving her adopted family would require more than just legal arguments. It would demand a complete reframing of how the territory viewed its indigenous inhabitants. Henry, the tribe's young war chief, arrived unexpectedly in Cheyenne with news that both heartened and alarmed Margaret. The tribe had begun fortifying their position along the river, but in a way that emphasized their role as traders and peacekeepers rather than warriors. They had opened their trading post to all, demonstrating their commitment to commerce over conflict. As autumn deepened toward winter, Margaret found herself at the center of a growing movement. The river communities, long accustomed to cooperation out of necessity, began to speak out against the threatened military action. The web of relationships she had nurtured over the years, both personal and professional, proved stronger than Frank's schemes. But the final confrontation still loomed ahead. The early autumn wind carried a chill as Margaret Anderson stood at the riverbank near Cheyenne, cradling the infant chief's son against her chest. 6 months had passed since she'd rescued the baby during the flash flood that claimed his mother's life. And in that time, she had earned an unprecedented position of respect within the tribe. The elders called her Shadow Mother, a sacred title never before bestowed upon an outsider. But today, dark clouds gathered on the horizon as both her worlds collided. Daniel Clark, the ruthless trader who'd been pressuring the tribe to sell their profitable river access, had discovered the truth about the baby's lineage. Through his network of spies, he'd learned that Margaret wasn't just caring for any orphaned child. She was raising Standing River's only heir. In Daniel's twisted mind, this gave him leverage he could use to force the tribe's hand in negotiations. He'd sent word that unless Margaret brought the child to his trading post by sundown, he would expose a fabricated story about her kidnapping the infant. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Margaret's shoulders as she watched canoes glide past on the wide river. The trading post's location had made the tribe prosperous, allowing them to control commerce along this vital stretch of water. But Daniel Clark's arrival had brought nothing but tension, with his attempts to monopolize all trade through his own operation. The tribe's council of elders had unanimously rejected his offers, but now he was targeting their most vulnerable point, their future chief. Frank Moore, Margaret's closest ally among the tribal warriors, appeared silently beside her. His weathered face showed deep concern as he spoke in low tones. Clark's men are gathering at the trading post, at least 20 hired guns. He touched the medicine pouch at his neck, a gift from his grandmother that he claimed could sense approaching danger. Whatever you decide, Shadow Mother, we stand with you. The tribe's warriors are ready. Margaret nodded, knowing she had to choose her next steps carefully. The situation had grown even more complex with the arrival of Robert Walker, a federal Indian agent who'd come to investigate reports of rising tensions. Though he presented himself as neutral, Margaret had seen him sharing private conversations with Daniel Clark. She couldn't be certain where his true loyalties lay. The agent's presence added another layer of risk to any action she might take. One wrong move could bring government forces down on the tribe. Inside her cabin, Margaret laid the sleeping infant in his intricately beaded cradle, a gift from the tribal craftswomen who had embraced her as their own. The walls were adorned with symbolic paintings telling the story of how she'd plunged into the raging waters to save the child, earning her place among them. But now those same walls felt like they were closing in. She had until sunset to make a decision that would affect not just her life, but the future of an entire people. Charlie Taylor, the tribe's master hunter, brought news that changed everything. He'd discovered Daniel Clark's true plan. The traitor had no intention of honoring any agreement. Documents Charlie had found revealed Clark's scheme to use the baby as a hostage, forcing the tribe to not only surrender their river rights but also relocate to less desirable lands. The traitor had already sold promises of the territory to railroad interests, pocketing advance payments that would leave him desperate to deliver. Margaret's mind raced as she formulated a plan. The tribe's women had taught her their secret ways of moving through the forest, traditional knowledge passed down through generations. She knew hidden paths that Clark's men would never suspect existed, but using them would mean trusting completely in her adopted family's ways, something that would test every instinct from her former life as a settler's daughter. Susan Moore, Frank's sister and the tribe's most skilled healer, arrived with bundles of herbs and medicines. "The stars speak of great change tonight," she said, laying out sacred items in a protective circle, "but they also show the path of the mother bear, fierce in defense of her cub." Margaret understood the message. She had been chosen by forces greater than herself to protect this child. Now was the time to fully embrace that destiny, whatever the cost. Martha Clark, Daniel's estranged wife, secretly came to Margaret as the sun began to set. Her revelation shook the very foundation of the conflict. Daniel's desperate push for the land wasn't just about money. He was dying, consumed by a wasting disease, and determined to leave a legacy that would outlive him. His own father had lost everything in failed business ventures, and Daniel was obsessed with not sharing the same fate. This understanding of his motivation gave Margaret the key to resolving the crisis. Through carefully passed messages, Margaret arranged a meeting at the sacred burial grounds, neutral territory where even Daniel Clark would have to show respect. As darkness fell, she wrapped the baby in traditional blankets and made her way through the forest. The entire tribe moved silently with her, hundreds of people appearing like spirits between the trees. They would face this challenge as one family, bound by something stronger than blood. What happened next would be told around tribal fires for generations. Margaret stepped into the firelight carrying not just the future chief, but also the wisdom of two worlds. She had learned that true power came not from control or ownership, but from understanding and respect. The confrontation that followed would change not just the tribe's future, but the very nature of relations between settlers and native peoples along the entire river valley. The firelight caught Daniel Clark's weathered face as he emerged from the shadows, flanked by a dozen armed men. His eyes fixed first on the baby in Margaret's arms, then swept across the assembled tribe members with barely concealed disdain. The trading post owner had come prepared for conflict, but the sacred ground's ancient power seemed to drain some of his usual swagger. Margaret stood her ground, the infant sleeping peacefully against her chest. The rhythmic sound of drums began somewhere in the darkness, a heartbeat that seemed to rise from the earth itself. She had learned this ceremony from the tribe's elders. It was traditionally used to mark moments when the people faced great change. "You're outnumbered, Clark," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the still night air. "But that's not why you'll leave here tonight without what you came for. Look around you. Really look. Every face you see belongs to someone who trades at your post, who brings furs and goods that fill your warehouses. Are a few acres of riverfront worth turning all these people against you? Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his hand never far from his gun. Behind him, Robert, his youngest son, stepped forward with an unexpected look of shame. "Father," he said, "Margaret's right. I've been keeping the books. Without the tribe's trade, we'll be bankrupt within a season. And there's something else you should know." Robert pulled out a yellowed document from his coat. "I found this in the old files. The land you're claiming, it was never yours to sell. The original treaty specifically protected it as tribal territory. If this went to a federal court..." He let the implications hang in the air. The tension crackled like the burning logs, sparks rising into the star-filled sky. Margaret could feel the collective breath of hundreds held in anticipation. She had known Robert was different from his father, had seen his quiet resistance to Daniel's schemes, but this revelation changed everything. Daniel Clark's face went through a complex series of emotions: anger, betrayal, calculation, and finally, a grudging acceptance. "Seems I've been outmaneuvered," he said slowly. "By my own son, no less." He turned to Margaret, something like respect finally showing in his eyes. "You've built quite a family here, ma'am. Bigger than mine, it appears." The drums grew louder as Margaret stepped forward, the baby stirring in her arms. "It doesn't have to be a competition, Daniel. The river's big enough for all of us if we're wise enough to share it. Your trading post could be a bridge between our peoples, not a barrier." The tribal elders moved forward, their faces painted with ceremonial markings that glowed in the firelight. They had prepared for this moment, understanding that the old ways must sometimes bend to forge new paths. The chief's sister began to sing, her voice carrying ancient words of welcome and warning. As the night deepened, agreements were made and promises exchanged. Margaret watched as Daniel Clark and his men participated in their first tribal ceremony, awkward at first, but gradually relaxing as food and peace pipes were shared. Robert sat with the young warriors, already building the connections that would help ensure the peace lasted. The baby awoke and cooed, reaching tiny fingers toward the stars. Margaret smiled, knowing that this child would grow up in a world where boundaries were not barriers but meeting places. She had become more than just a mother to one. She was now a bridge between worlds, a keeper of both traditions and change. Dawn was breaking when the last agreements were sealed. The river would remain open to all, the trading post would operate under new rules of fairness, and the tribe's territories would be respected. Margaret stood at the edge of the burial ground, watching the first rays of sun paint the water gold. She had not just protected a family legacy, she had helped create a new one, built on understanding instead of fear. The story spread quickly along the river valleys, carried by traders and travelers. In Dodge City, they spoke of the white woman who had become mother to a tribe. In Cheyenne, merchants adjusted their practices, hearing of the new peace. And in countless camps and settlements, people began to see that the future might hold something better than endless conflict. Margaret's legend grew, but she cared little for that. Her days were filled with the real work of building bridges, teaching tribal children to read English while learning their ancient stories, helping Robert transform the trading post into a true meeting place, watching her adopted son grow strong in the wisdom of two worlds. She had found her true home where the waters met, in the space between cultures where new dreams could grow. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Cheyenne trading post as Margaret Anderson's new reality settled over her like a warm blanket. After months of uncertainty, Chief Running Bear had made his proclamation before the entire tribe. She would be recognized not just as Little Hawk's adopted mother, but as a true daughter of the people. The announcement sent ripples through both the native and settler communities along the North Platte River. Martha Clark, the trading post owner's wife, watched with a mixture of awe and concern as Margaret moved easily between two worlds. "You understand what this means, don't you?" she asked one evening as they sorted trade goods. "You'll have responsibilities to both communities now." Margaret nodded, remembering how far she'd come from her early days as a frightened widow, seeking a new start out west. The tribe's medicine woman, an elderly but sharp-eyed woman called Many Songs, took special interest in teaching Margaret their healing ways. Hours were spent learning which river plants held medicinal properties, how to prepare poultices, and the sacred songs that accompanied traditional treatments. Little Hawk would toddle after them on these excursions, already showing an uncanny ability to spot useful herbs among the riverside vegetation. Robert Taylor, the gruff army captain who'd initially opposed Margaret's unusual arrangement with the tribe, found himself gradually won over by her diplomatic skills. She proved invaluable in smoothing relations between soldiers and natives, translating not just words but cultural meanings that often got lost in translation. Her presence helped prevent several potential conflicts from escalating into violence. Frank Moore, a young settler who'd been sweet on Margaret since her arrival, discovered that his romantic aspirations would need to adapt to her new status. The tribe considered her family now, which meant any courtship would require their approval. To his credit, Frank began learning tribal customs and making efforts to prove himself worthy in their eyes. The summer brought both celebration and challenge as a devastating fever swept through the region. Margaret worked tirelessly alongside many songs, combining Western medicine from her past life with native healing traditions. Together they saved many lives, including that of Chief Running Bear's elderly mother. This only cemented Margaret's position within the tribal hierarchy. Little Hawk continued to flourish under Margaret's care, growing into a curious and confident toddler who moved easily between cultures. The boy showed an innate understanding of his unique position, already displaying leadership qualities that made the elders nod in approval. Margaret often found herself marveling at how this child had transformed her life so completely. Daniel Walker, the territory's newly appointed Indian agent, initially questioned the legitimacy of Margaret's unusual status. But after witnessing her effectiveness in negotiating fair trading agreements and mediating disputes, he became one of her strongest advocates in Washington. Her success offered a new model for peaceful coexistence along the frontier. As autumn progressed, Margaret organized a harvest celebration that brought together tribal members and settlers in an unprecedented sharing of food, music, and traditions. Children played games from both cultures while elders exchanged stories. Even the most hardened skeptics had to admit that something remarkable was taking shape along this stretch of the North Platte. The winter months proved particularly challenging as heavy snows isolated various communities. Margaret's knowledge of both worlds proved crucial in coordinating mutual aid between settlements and tribal camps. She organized hunting parties that combined native tracking skills with settler weapons, ensuring no one went hungry during the harsh season. Charlie Anderson, Margaret's brother-in-law, arrived from Deadwood with news that initially threatened to upset the delicate balance she'd achieved. He carried papers showing claim to lands that the tribe considered sacred burial grounds. But rather than allowing conflict to erupt, Margaret facilitated a compromise that protected both the sacred sites and settler interests. By spring, Margaret's unique position had evolved into something even more remarkable. She became known as a keeper of two worlds' wisdom, trusted by both sides to maintain the delicate balance required for peace. Young tribal women sought her advice on adapting to changing times, while settler wives came to learn traditional skills that made frontier life easier. Rachel Taylor, the captain's wife, finally abandoned her initial prejudices and became one of Margaret's closest friends. Together they established a school that taught children from both communities, preserving important traditions while preparing them for an increasingly interconnected future. Little Hawk was among the first students, already showing promise as a bridge between cultures. The following summer brought a visiting delegation of government officials from Washington, eager to study what they'd heard about this unusual arrangement. Margaret's success had attracted attention as a possible model for Indian relations elsewhere. Though she knew their interest was more political than practical, she hoped some good might come from sharing their story. As Little Hawk's 5th birthday approached, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary path that had led her to this moment. What had begun as a desperate act of compassion had grown into something far more significant. She had indeed become mother to an entire people, not by erasing differences but by helping each side recognize the value in the other's ways. The autumn winds swept across the river valley as Margaret stood beside Little Hawk during the traditional coming-of-age ceremony. Though only 5, his role as future chief meant these early rituals held special significance. She watched with pride as he received his first ceremonial feather, presented jointly by tribal elders and Henry, who had become an unexpected bridge between the communities. The boy's steady composure reminded her so much of his father, the late chief whose vision had first welcomed her into their circle. In Dodge City, word of their success had spread, bringing both opportunity and challenge. Traders who once avoided the area now made regular stops, creating a bustling marketplace where native crafts sold alongside manufactured goods. Rachel and Susan, who had initially doubted Margaret's unconventional path, now helped manage a cooperative store that ensured fair prices for both communities. Their children played freely with tribal youngsters, the old fears and prejudices fading with each passing season. The school had grown beyond Margaret's wildest dreams, with Martha and Laura joining as teachers for the expanding student body. They taught in both English and the tribal language, preserving stories and traditions while opening doors to new possibilities. Even Frank, once the most skeptical of the townspeople, had donated lumber to build additional classrooms after seeing his own grandchildren thrive in this blended environment. As winter approached, Margaret received word from Cheyenne that government officials were considering replicating their model in other territories. But she knew their success couldn't simply be copied. It had grown organically from mutual respect and shared hardship. During the long evenings, she began writing down their story, determined to capture the truth of their journey for future generations. Little Hawk often sat beside her, adding his own memories of the tales told around council fires. The spring brought unexpected visitors from Deadwood, representatives from other tribes who had heard of their achievement. They spent weeks observing the delicate balance Margaret and the community had struck, particularly interested in how traditional governance had been preserved while adapting to changing times. Charlie, who had become an informal diplomat, helped translate the nuanced discussions about sovereignty and cooperation. Robert, now serving as mayor, worked tirelessly to protect their unique arrangement from outside interference. When land speculators arrived with glossy promises, he stood firm alongside tribal leaders, maintaining the boundaries that kept their shared territory secure. The river remained their lifeline, its waters continuing to nurture both communities as they had for generations. One crisp morning, Margaret found Little Hawk at his father's memorial, carefully placing fresh sage as he'd been taught. "Mother," he said in English before switching to his native tongue, "I understand now why the rivers never stop flowing. They carry our stories forward." His wisdom, beyond his years, brought tears to her eyes. This child she had saved had indeed become a symbol of hope, not just for their communities but for a different way of living together. As summer returned, Margaret watched a new crop of children, some fair-haired, some dark, learning to fish in the traditional ways under Daniel's patient guidance. The old warrior had become one of their most valued teachers, sharing not just skills but the deeper wisdom of living in harmony with the land. These children would grow up knowing two worlds, not as separate spheres to choose between, but as complementary parts of their shared heritage. The story of how a desperate rescue had transformed into a model of cooperation continued to unfold, each season bringing new challenges and triumphs. Margaret knew their work was far from finished, but as she watched Little Hawk leading both tribal and town children in a traditional game, she felt a deep sense of peace. They had created something precious here along the river's edge. Not just a community, but a living example of how the future might look if people chose to see past their differences to the common ground beneath their feet.